Hi, welcome to Uskogan's the International Law Podcast. In this episode, I'm joined by Dr. Ntina Tzouvala, who is a senior lecturer at Australian National University. Her work focuses on the history and theory of international law, with a special emphasis on political economy, race, and imperialism. She is the author of the groundbreaking book, Capitalism as Civilisation, A History of International Law, which has injected a new life in the critical understanding of international law and has been making a lot of rounds on Twitter and the internet in the past few months. So thank you, Dina, for joining me, for this conversation. I guess you have been, doing a lot of talks and webinars on your book. So I'll try not to, make you talk a lot on that front. I'm more interested in your understanding of and approaches towards international law and the way you go about your work. So yeah, I'll just start right away, and I want to begin with your origin story in terms of what's your background, where did you go to school, and how come you are doing what you're doing now.
Sure, thank you. And to begin with, thank you so much for the invitation and for having me in your podcast. So yeah, I'm originally Greek. I studied, I went to school in Greece. I did my undergrad law degree in Greece. So I've said that before. I'm trained as a doctrinal civil lawyer, right? And in my undergrad, I didn't really pay so much attention to international law. My marks in international law were like fine, but nothing to write home about. And then I went for a master's degree in the UK, and I was kind of like into public law in Greece, but obviously because the system was so different in the UK, I chose to do public international law so that to make it kind of transferable. And up until that point, I was pretty ignorant about critical approaches, to be honest. I was a student activist, so I was reading a lot of like leftist theory, critical theory in that regard, but I didn't know much about critical legal theory at all. So it was kind of a revelation moving from a pretty doctrinal environment to the UK, where obviously I got exposed much more to critical approaches writ large, and then I decided to do my PhD in international law. So that's pretty much the background. So weird combination of doctrinal civil law training, doctrinal international law training. I did my master's at UCL, and then an independent, non-law related interest to Marxism and in critical theory. So it's a weird background.
No, that's very interesting. So how would you currently describe your critique and your politics of international law, the framework that you use? How would you describe that?
Yeah, I mean, that's always such a tricky question, right? Because we all use different labels to mean very different things. So I would say, I would definitely say I do critical approaches to international law in the broadest sense possible. I do TWAIL, I do third world approaches to international law, and I also do, obviously, Marxist approaches to international law. And I mean, these labels couldn't include all and any kind of people. But I think what I am really interested I'm really interested in the intersections between international law and political economy. And especially even more interested in the intersections between international law and political economy, either through lenses that we don't usually think about them, so race, or in places in international law where we don't usually look at for political economy. So international law and the use of force would be an example. So I think I'm more attached to the things I'm interested in rather than, particular labels or monikers. I mean, everybody knows I do have a pretty transparent theoretical framework. That's not a secret, right? But I think that's the thing. Paradoxically, I'm less attached to. I'm much more attached to the things I find interesting.
do you feel it's annoying if you get pigeonholed or bracketed into one type of theory at the expense of others, because sometimes those intersections are so intense that it might not be that easy to separate somebody as a Marxist scholar or as a CLS scholar or as a 12 scholar? And how do you identify the distinctions between these sub branches of critical approaches?
Right. Yeah, so I think, listen, sometimes these shorthands are useful, right? I'm not rejecting them at all. And I think they're much less useful in a sense as individual self-identifications or identities. They're much more useful as collections of people who do stuff together and they do talk to each other, right? I think they can be useful to the extent that it doesn't exactly describe who I am, but to the extent that it describes who is it that I talk to, literally talk to. So people who still are around and they're doing work, but also people who I talk to in my head, they are not responding because they have been long dead. So I think they can be useful to that extent, right? And I think then the distinctions between critical legal approaches and CLS, let's say, Tweo and Marxist would be, I think that it would come down to a much more nitty-gritty distinction if you wanted to make this a meaningful discussion, not necessarily about distinctions between these three, but distinctions between specific people and even specific times within specific people's trajectories, right? So in a sense, many trailers would have a certain implicit or explicit incorporation of certain CLS tenets, most commonly indeterminacy. But I would say it's not everyone, right? And I would say some of the 12 critique and some of the Marxist critique, in many respects, is not critical in the sense of CLS. It's critical in many other senses, but it does treat law as rules with definitive content. Is just the content is kind of dodgy, right? So whereas I would say there's other Twailers and there's other Marxists, and I do count myself in that category for sure, who do take on some of the conclusions of CLS, especially of legal indeterminacy, but try to figure out how to square them with other intuitions, for example, intuitions that have to do with imperialism or intuitions that have to do with economic exploitation. So I think the answer to the question would be, again, I could tell you the similarities or the differences between these three things if we talk in relationship to particular people or particular subgroups of people rather than the broader movements.
Right. Would it be a fair assessment to say that you identify more towards the Marxist, sub branch of critical approaches, and why is that?
Absolutely. I can't really. I can. Why is that? Because I was a student activist in Athens 15 years ago. Like, I can't tell you why I ended up doing this, but I can tell you what I think we gain by doing it. People adopt theories and ideologies for all sorts of reasons that we are not always very conscious of why we're doing it. So I find Marxist approaches more persuasive, both in law and in life, for a bunch of reasons. But in law, and especially, let's say within other critical approaches, I am quite committed to asking questions about causality. Why do things happen? Why does international law look the way it looks and not in another way? Or why, if not all international law, why does this specific rule or this specific regime looks the way it looks? And I feel that the past 20 years, and even before that, critical approaches have been quite suspicious of why questions. There is a certain mistrust both towards grand narratives, but even towards anything that is very epistemologically ambitious, right? But I am actually
Right.
really drawn to things that are epistemologically ambitious. So that is one thing. I like why questions, and it doesn't mean that I can answer them, but I think that at the very least we ought to pose them and do our best in answering them. The other thing that I think Marxism offers in international law is, or has the potential to offer in international law, is a sense of historical concreteness, right? And I know we said we wouldn't talk much about the book, but that's one of the things
No,
I'm
we
trying
can.
to
You can talk as
no, no,
you can talk about the book as much as you want. That's entirely up to
sure, you're kind. So, like, in a sense, just to bring an example from the book, I think Tony Young's work is pivotal, right? It's the cornerstone to the stuff many of us do. But at the same time, I am in the record saying in the book that the dynamics of difference as an explanatory scheme is a pretty all-encompassing scheme, right? You could say that many legal systems beyond Eurocentric international law have some sort of a dynamics of difference, right? They draw boundaries. These boundaries distinguish between its insiders and outsiders, and then they devise legal techniques on how to handle the outsider, right? The Sinocentric legal system had been doing these for centuries before it was interrupted by Western imperialism in the 19th century. So I think Marxism asks the question more than any other critical legal theory of, like, what was it in particular moments that was read as difference, and what was it that was read as sameness, and why at a particular moment in the late 19th century difference or sameness acquired different characteristics than it had in the 16th century, or, as I was saying before, in the Sinocentric legal system, right? So I think this impulse towards historical specificity, again, is something that I find very productive.
Right. Yeah. So there's a lot to unpack there, and thank you for comprehensively talking about your position. There's a few things that I would like to talk about with regards to critical approaches. So you mentioned the aspects of legal indeterminacy, and also some discussion of formalism and anti-formalism. How we deal with international law as rules or not. So critical approaches generally, they do receive criticism in terms of that, they talk in the abstract, and they deal a lot with deconstruction and don't offer a lot of constructive value in terms of breaking down structures, whether it's regarding inclusion and exclusion of different actors and sub-actors, as you talked about. So how would you respond to that? Even scholars such as Anthony Angie and B.S. Chimney, they tend to be, I don't know, perhaps pushed a bit to the fringes, that they don't deal with mainstream international scholarship, and this is TOEL or this is CLS, this is Marxism, and this is just just a mental exercise which is not offering any practical tangible value to international scholarship. How would you respond to these simplistic
Sure.
understandings?
Yeah, so listen, there would be a number of levels in which to answer this question, right? One, and it would be the easy one, but sometimes the easy and the obvious one is a good way to go, is there is currently 4 or 5 UN special rapporteurs who are in one way or another TOELers, or associated with TOEL, or inspired by TOEL. So Marco Fakhri, Tendai Chumi, Obi Okafor, Balakrishnan. So there's like a bunch, and that's like quite practical, right? As practical as it goes. So that would be one aspect that I think the last 5 years there is a bunch of TOELers who have like actually beaten the bullet and assumed a pretty active position in international law, and one that, as you know, comes without, without a salary or anything. You don't do UN special rapporteuring for the riches. So that would be one aspect, and I think it's an interesting thing. It's an interesting thing in its own right, but I think it also goes some way towards responding to this thing. The second aspect would be that I think what this critique ignores is how much international law itself, at least academic international law, has changed the last 15 years because of TWAIL and as a reaction to TWAIL, right? So I think TWAIL has had, even at a certain surface level, we can discuss how much this is an actual transformation at the core, but it has had a significant impact in the way international law is being taught in universities, at least in Anglophone spaces, right? I think it's a very different situation beyond Anglophone. Like I think if you walked into a room in 2021 and said that international law in 2021 has something to do about imperialism, that wouldn't be like a hugely controversial statement to make. And this is because of TWAIL, right? This is when Angie published his book, that was considered a pretty far out argument. And I think today people, at least at a certain surface level, do respond to this thing. This is something that at least at a certain level is accepted. So that would be my second answer to that. And my third answer about that, and again, I've been on the record saying that before, I sound a little bit like a broken record, but it is that I don't think it's the job of academic international lawyers to pretend that we are judges. It's great that we are not, right? I don't envy people who have to give authoritative yes or no questions. And we need that, right? I'm not saying we don't, but if that is not our jobs, if we are lucky enough that this is not our jobs, it's okay not to give authoritative yes or no questions and to allow yourself to think in different ways, right? There's no way why our thinking and our writing and our scholarship should necessarily mimic the structure of judicial reasoning and judicial decision. It's actually, and I've said that before, I think it's people who do that need to think why it is they're doing it, because some of them are actually having an effect on practice. But I would say even amongst doctrinal legal scholarship, I would say it's debatable whether a 10% of doctrinal legal scholars can actually, seriously claim that they have an effect on practice. They don't. Most of our articles are read by very few people and they have very little impact in the outside world, right? And that doesn't mean that I think this work is not valuable. I think it can be extraordinarily valuable for clarifying our thinking. But I think also this idea that doctrinal scholarship somehow is all practical and all has an immediate effect in the world, it's not true. It's just not true. So I think if we are not having an immediate impact, we might as well think freely, right? And not try to pretend we are judges, because we are not.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I guess every, the critical approaches has its own domain, and it doesn't, have to mimic what is happening in, mainstream scholarship or practice. How does formalism, play a role into this? And, when I, go about reading, TWAIL scholars and critical approaches, I ask myself that what are the assumptions or structures that we take at face value, that we assume to begin with, and to what extent we deconstruct those structures, rules, or perhaps if you call it the orthodoxy of international law, how it has come about to be established. Because you talk about that TWAIL is now being taught and debated in a lot of settings. Yeah, but I feel in countries like I come from Pakistan, so we were taught by books by Malcolm Shaw or Malcolm Evans, in which there's hardly any discussion of the critical approaches. We just taught international as a system of rules that exists today, and I guess that will change in the coming years. But I'm not sure if I confused you with a lot of things, but yeah,
No,
how do
you
you how
didn't.
do you
That is a fair enough, and that is how I was taught international law, right? And I think this is, I'm not sure, but I think this is how people are still taught international law in grades. So I am partially, and I think I hinted at that before, and I should, reiterate that at the same time, I think these changes are happening in a relatively small group of Anglophone universities, especially in the global north, right? Not exclusively. So there are places like Jindal in India where there would be a heavily critical education, but I agree with you. And I think that would be also a really interesting discussion to have, right? For what reasons critical work, critical legal work became so marginalized in the global south. And I think many times there is very immediate practical reasons. You want to train, if you're like a poor state, you need to train people to go into the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and practice. I understand that perfectly. But many times this basically happened because of political events in the 70s and the 80s. Like Dar es Salaam was a center for not critical legal thought in the sense of Harvard, but of critical thinking about the law, right? And then it stopped being because the political situation changed, and a lot of Marxists and a lot of leftist legal thinkers had to leave. So I think that is also, for many people who criticize critical approaches from a identitarian global south perspective, they say, oh, people in the global south don't care about these things. They ignore the fact that this sort of very formalist legal education was partly, not exclusively, but partly the effect of basically dictatorships in the 80s and the 90s. And if you were doing any sort of critical thinking about the law, about society, you were either in huge trouble or you had to leave. So that would be my first beat. And the second about formalism. So I think formalism can be interesting as a pedagogical device, right? When I teach international law, sometimes, not always, especially in the beginning, I do teach international law as rules, right? At the end of the day, there is an immense pedagogical value in that. And there is also an immense, depending on the circumstances, an immense practical value in that, right? Sometimes when you want to restrain the use of force, you have to make formalist arguments that treat law as rules. It's another question about whether the intellectual allure of legal formalism is as big, and my answer to that would be no. And also, interestingly, I think sometimes even very formalist people, when they teach international law, when they practice international law, they don't really act like they believe in formalists. So, many times we would tell our students, I tell my students that very often, the outcome, the way you answer the question doesn't matter. What it matters is the reasoning, right? It matters how you get there. And I'm not the only one. Other people do that too, and people who are formalists do that too. What that says, without saying it, is I think that international law is a way of reasoning, and I think international law is a specialized language which you have to start using in a convincing way. I don't think it's rules, because if we really, really thought it was rules, we would be like, yeah, there is one right way to answer the exam question, and there very rarely is. There's some wrong ways to answer the exam question. There's definitely wrong ways, but there's also more than one right way, right? And when we teach, sometimes I feel we accept that we don't exactly believe that this is only rules, because we say to people, I just want to see your reasoning, I just want to see your way of thinking, and the conclusion you reach at the end of the day. Or when we are, in JESOP or whatever international mood, or any mood, right, when we are asking our students to construct arguments for both sides, we are asking them to treat international law or law as a language. We are not asking them to treat it as rules, even if we say we are treating them as rules. So where I'm trying to go here is that I think formalism is, in my view, still the dominant approach in international law. I can see both its pedagogical and its tactical uses, but also I can see how much people sleep when they start, especially teaching the law, in which case law suddenly becomes much more a terrain of argumentative struggle rather than rules that we know the content if only we think really hard.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting, and that's very insightful. And I guess to make sense of things, sometimes you do need to rely on formalist styles of argumentation. And I also heard that when you were defending your PhD thesis, you did not realize your understanding of international law was as formalist as you thought. So I found that very interesting. Yeah. So, I want to move towards, the role of inclusion and exclusion, in, international law, as, you have also written about this, in terms of the role of imperialism and, colonization in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. So how does international law otherize or exclude certain people, certain narratives, certain subsystems? And is this a recent phenomenon?
Yeah. So as I was saying before, I think all legal systems or most legal systems include or exclude, right? And I think a legal system that wouldn't exclude would be a pretty monstrous legal system, a legal system that claims jurisdiction over everyone and everything. I don't think it's a good
Yeah.
thing to all include. And that's what I tried to say also in my book, right? That we treating inclusion as the good thing and exclusion as the bad thing. And I'm not the first one to say that. Martin King says that at some point, but I think I decided to follow, this way of thinking to its end. And my point partly, for example, in the book and in other work that I have done is sometimes the oppressive function of international law is in the way in which it includes. By saying to political communities, of course you can be included, but you need to have an army and a police, and you need to have private law and private property in order to be included, right? So that sometimes the trick is the inclusion. And as I was saying in the beginning of my answer, I think what is interesting is not the inclusion and the exclusion as such, because every legal system does that, is why at certain moments of time, race, in many quotation marks, became a ground of exclusion, right? Which it wasn't always and forever. Or why did at certain moment of time having contract law and a police to enforce it become the ground of inclusion? So I think this is a much more interesting and generative question, because also it saves us a little bit from things like anachronism, right? Looking far at the past and assuming that these inclusions and exclusions had always the same flavor and the same content just because inclusion and exclusion as a dynamics existed. So for me, that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in figuring out, is inclusion and exclusion in 2021 different to inclusion and exclusion in 1910? And if so, how? And if so, what does that tell us about the international political and economic environment in which international law operates?
Right. So how would you understand, the conditions of inclusion with becoming a modern capitalist state?
Yeah, so what I try to say again in the book is to say that international law placed upon especially non-white majority, non-Christian majority states a number of demands, right? And these were things like, as I said before, you had to have a police, and you had to have an army, and you had to have, at the very least, contract and property, right? The ground, the basic scaffolding and the basic legal scaffolding of capitalist relations. You had to have some sort of separation of powers. What has been interesting is that obviously at the very basic level, these demands remain constant. But at a more granular level, these demands have been evolving. So in the 1990s and early 2000s, it wasn't just enough to have property and contracts. You had to be some sort of pretty dedicated neoliberal state, right? So it wasn't, you had to privatize a number of things that in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s we tolerated or we even promoted being controlled by the state. Or to move back to the past, in the interwar period, under the League of Nations, you had to at least put up some pretense of welfarism, right? It didn't have to be, anything very humane or anything very substantial, but you had to show that, you're building sanitation systems and you're doing something about the labor question, right? So this, I do think that there is some constants, but at the same time, I think we would be painting with a very broad brush, unacceptably broad brush, if we didn't see also that these preconditions are changing. And I think it would be interesting to think and to see where this early 21st century consensus will go now that both international law is becoming much more multipolar, but also when perhaps not neoliberalism, but the most aggressive iterations thereof are becoming a little bit less popular, at least in public.
Right. That's very interesting. Like you to talk a bit about the work that you have done in the book. And I must confess, I haven't read the entire book. I've read excerpts, that were publicly available. I've, seen your webinars, especially the one with the Asian Society of International Law. So I'd like to understand, and for our audiences as well, how does the idea of standard of civilization play a role, in this exclusionary exercise?
Yeah, thank you. So my point goes something like that. I'm saying that since the last quarter of the 19th century, civilization became perhaps not the only, perhaps not the primary, even though I think I could say is the primary. It's not the only, but it's the primary means through which this inclusion exclusion tango has been working in international law, right? And my point is that for a time, people use the word civilization, its derivatives, especially uncivilized and lack of civilization, but it doesn't matter so much if we do. The question is, are we still replicating the same patterns of inclusion and exclusion? And I'm saying, inclusion took the form of what I called logic of improvement, that said what we've been discussing a minute ago, right? That said, if you become a modern capitalist state, if you have contracts and property, if you have police, if you have some sort of like an independent government, if you have territorial control as the method of projecting political power, you will get equal rights and duties. So I'm saying inclusion became specifically about capitalist modernity. It didn't become primarily about Christianity, even though it helped if you were Christian. And it didn't become primarily about other things, about geography or whatever. Again, it helped, right? It almost created a rebuttable, if you were like a Christian majority state or a white majority state, it almost created a rebuttable presumption that you were following this logic of, and then I'm saying, but at the same time, there is an opposite, a countervailing force. And that is what I call the logic of biology, that says, well, sure, you do all these reforms, but you're not quite there. And why you're not quite there? You're not quite there because we treat you as a racialized subject, or we talk about your political community as if like in a feminized register, or we talk about you like your children. We say that, you're not quite there yet. And I'm saying, again, this is to biologize difference is a thing that happened extremely recently. And it's a very historically concrete moment in which difference or exclusion becomes contingent upon biology. Obviously a misunderstanding of biology, right? I'm not saying any of that was like a good solid understanding of human biology. So I'm saying that like this tango between improvement as capitalist modernity and biology as racial and gendered exclusion structured international law since the last quarter roughly of the 19th century. And even though we are not using the word civilized so much anymore because it got a bad rap, we are still argumentative patterns still replicate this conundrum.
Right. I'm glad the chapter that I read had discussion on the logics of improvement in biology. So I understand, where you're coming from. I like to move a bit towards the scholarship from Global South. And you talk about how, it's going beyond the margins and entering into mainstream scholarship and making impact in terms of, the role of special rapporteurs. But how do you think it can go beyond this, and in terms of creating an impact in the mainstream scholarship? Because I recently had Chris Van Eyck, my fellow from Leiden, so he works on space law. He talked about how there was a lot of work and input from Global South and countries from the Global South in developing work on outer space treaties, but it was not reflected in the years that followed, the decades that followed. I just like to know your perspective on how the Global South scholarship is doing, and where do you see it going?
Sure. So the first question would be, the first part of the answer rather, would be contingent on what we were discussing before, right? Which is, for example, TWAIL needs to expand beyond a limited bunch of Anglophone universities in the global north and a couple of universities in the global south. And I think it is obviously very slowly, because and also I think it's important to point out that some of the barriers are conceptual and ideological. Some of them are really material, right? People don't have access to resources. They don't have access to the sort of books and articles and whatever I had access to when I moved to London. So that is one thing. And I think, in that regard, I think it's essential for all of us who work in the global north to share our work. If colleagues from the Global South get in touch, we should just send them PDFs, we shouldn't be weird knowing about that stuff. And that's, by the way, an invitation to anyone listening to the podcast. You can get in touch with me.
Sounds good. Thank you for that, generous offer.
No, I think if you want something to be genuinely a movement, you have to enable, right? You have to put your money when your mouth is. So that would be one thing. I think the other thing, though, and I think we have to be realistic about it, about the limitations of how much this sort of critical scholarship can have an effect on, let's say, the practice of states, right? Because what is usually called the first generation TWAIL, we can discuss whether that's a good moniker. I don't think it is, but Bejawi, all these people, they were government lawyers or government adjacent lawyers at a time when third worldism as a political project was at its peak, right? Third worldism is dead as a political project, has been dead for 30, 40 years. And it's also really difficult now for many people who identify with TWAIL to work with many third world governments, because the realization has slowly been that, and it's what Chimney said, that, the post-colonial stage turned out in most instances not to be a vehicle of emancipation. And that Chimney says that, the solidarity of Wales should be with the peoples of the global South rather than the governments, that very often they are not necessarily up to extremely good stuff. So I think that's a limitation. And that's a limitation that I don't think that scholarship can solve, right? Scholarship itself cannot create the political power you need on the ground to change things. I think politics can create the political change you need on the ground to change things. So I think, in a sense, have a sense that contemporary let's say 12 scholarship doesn't have many allies amongst third world governments or global South governments, right? It has some allies, and you can have, strategic alliances in the sense you work together with people you might disagree with many things, but you work with them on the things you agree with. But there is a limitation to that. And this limitation comes from the defeat of third worldism in the late 70s and the early 80s, and has nothing to do with how robust scholarship is. And of course, the other way is to say that you can work to the extent that you can with people on the ground, right? But obviously this will not produce, with social movements, with dissidents, whatever, but of course this will not produce the sort of immediate effect working with governments does, right? Because states have a much more central role in lawmaking in international law. That's
I guess scholarship cannot replace the role of politics, or or take over what politics is supposed to do. And I guess the Marxist lens also offers an interesting understanding of why that politics is the way it is, and the material and resource constraints that you talk about as well. It reminded me of Anthea Roberts' work in international, that very few books which are written in very few countries are being used by vast majority of other states, including former colonies, and the domestic cases that they refer to, they're also limited to, for example, let's say the United States or the UK, and that is extrapolated to create this sort of international perspective of sorts. So moving towards the latter part of this discussion, do you think what are some of the major blind spots in international scholarship and practice as they come in your work, and how what sort of changes do you think you would want in this regard?
Yeah. Oh wow. So obviously one of the things I'm working currently on is racism and international law. And it's not as if it's a blind spot, like a lot of people are working on race and racism and they're doing amazing work. And again, I'll refer to the work of Ntina Tzouvala, who's a professor, but she's also the special rapporteur for racism. But I think where does exist a blind spot is that for example, race and racism is considered relevant for international human rights law, for international refugee law, for international criminal law in very grave cases, but much less so on issues of international trade law or international investment law or the law of the international financial institutions, right? I think these two fields and subfields, of course, they are pretty siloed from each other, and people who do international, let's say, criminal law, most of them, not everyone, don't think too much about political economy. And those who think about political economy in international economic law don't think too much or at all about race and racism and racialization. So that, I think, is a major challenge international law is facing, especially because of everything that is happening, again, on the ground, and the movements for racial justice we have been witnessing the past few years. And obviously, as I was saying, I think in the beginning, the other bit is a pretty siloed understanding of where can we use the tools of political economy, and what is political economy for? And again, obviously, nobody would doubt that international economic law can be subjected to the scrutiny. I think fewer people would think of jus ad bellum or jus in bello as something that has a political economy. And I heard a colleague at the University of Melbourne, Luis Bogliolo, who actually wrote his PhD is a Marxist reading of aerial bombing in jus in bello. And he's thinking about jus in bello in terms of class and in terms of political economy, right? And as far as I know, this is the first time anyone has done anything like that. And of course, one doesn't need to do it from a specifically Marxist perspective, but a certain sort of political economy tools in fields that we don't usually think in these terms is, in my mind, a big gap, in the sense that we've been having since 9/11 these huge debates about jus ad bellum, very few, if any, of which have been talking about jus ad bellum after 9/11 and the privatization of war, or jus ad bellum after 9/11 and the fact that counterterrorism is a huge business, is $1 trillion.
It's an industry, it's a major industry.
Yeah, in a way that it's interesting, right? Because even 19th century liberal lawyers and also liberal internationalists were very alive to the question of armaments and disarmaments, right? And they were even some liberals in the 19th century were for peace. One of the things, so they were saying, we want arbitration, so the legalist bit, but they were also saying we want disarmament or limitations in armament. They had a sense that there was something there. And I think this has definitely been abandoned by liberals in international law, but I think it has been abandoned by everyone. And I think that's a big loss, that there is a tradition there and you don't need to subscribe to everything. But I think if 19th century liberals could think in these terms, certainly we can do that too.
All right, wow, that's the political economy of jus ad bellum and jus in bello. That's something I've not come across before, and I don't feel like there's a lot of scholarship on it. I guess that's something that we might see in the coming years, hopefully, and yeah, there's a lot to work around that. How do you see the role of feminism and gender-based approaches in reforming international law scholarship and practice in the coming years? Do you think that the movement is stepping up?
Yeah, so I think if there is one part of critical approaches that can show very, very tangible reforms in positive, hardcore international law, this is feminism, right? Feminists have been extraordinarily successful in bringing about changes in international law, especially in the fields of peace and security, so gender peace and security, in the fields of international criminal law, so acknowledging that rape can be a crime against humanity, and so on and so forth, right? I think I'm less immersed in these conversations, and I have to say that here. I do consider myself a feminist, but I don't do hardcore feminist international legal work. My sense is that feminists in international law, as many other legal feminists, suddenly are confronted for many reasons, but also because of the success and the demands of movements for racial justice. They have been confronted with certain dilemmas and uncertainties about the way feminist reform has been going about in international law, and especially its embrace of carcerality, embrace of criminal law as a solution, and also its always problematic, but partnership with institutions such as the Security Council, right? And also what Karen Engler called lately in her book, the grip of sexual violence, the fact that so much energy has been put into thinking about sexual violence and coming up with criminal solutions to sexual violence in the international field, in comparison to things like women's, again, a political economic critique, right, about the position of women in the global political economy and how international law subordinates many women. So I think international feminists, both in law and more broadly, I think they're at the crossroads about whether they/we will respond to the call of folks like Black Lives Matter and think about what it means to pursue gender justice through criminal means, criminal law means.
Yeah.
Even criminal means.
Even criminal means, yeah. Why not?
Yeah, or through imperial means, right? I think the challenge has been out there in theoretical level for some time, but I think now the question, the Black Lives Matter and other racial justice movements are making the question inevitable. And I think it would be good if feminism in international law responded to that.
Perfect. Yeah, that's we talked about a lot of things. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Tzouvala, for joining me in this conversation. I hope some of my questions were not too basic. Yeah. So but I think we talked about a lot of interesting things which will help our audience, understand your perspective and your work that you're doing. One last question: what are you reading these days? And is there something you'd like our viewers and listeners to look into?
Oh, okay. So in terms of work, I'm reading quite a bit about racial capitalism because I'm coediting with James Gatti, a special issue on racial capitalism and international investment law. So I'm reading stuff that have to do with racial capitalism. So anything coming from Cedric Robinson through South African Marxists of the 70s and the 80s to Fanon and things like that. And in my spare time, my bedtime reading is actually a really cool book called something like Guano and the Opening of the Pacific World. Guano, for those who don't know, is bird shit. Basically, but it's been really useful in fertilizers, right?
Right.
It's really cool because it's this sort of like social and environmental history of the Pacific through this one very narrow and quite, down and dirty thing. And I think it's really interesting both because, so I'm trying to read a little bit about the Pacific because this is where I am now. And it would be good to know, about your neighborhood. But I think it's also a really cool book because it's a good example on how you can use something small to show something big. And I find that, I think that has become obvious. I find that quite charming in scholarship.
Great. That's an interesting, recommendation, and hopefully I'll try to attach a few links with the post. Thank you, Dina. This has been really insightful. It's been a pleasure, talking to you. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next episode. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks for the invite.
Thank you.